your time, 2 minutes after 11 my time. Linda, is it okay if we get started, or
Please
should we wait a
do.
few more minutes, or?
Nope, please start.
Great, great. Well, good. Like I said, good morning. It's good to see everybody, even if it is virtual. I wish I could be there in person, but this is the next best thing. And I hope the next 90 minutes and then the 90 minutes this afternoon doesn't add to your Zoom fatigue. I think we've all experienced quite a bit of Zoom experience over the last 5 months or so, but it seems to work pretty good, and it does give us a chance to continue on with our activities without actually being present. So thank you for putting up with one more Zoom call today. I thought it would be easier if you looked at the PowerPoint presentation that was provided outside the screen instead of me sharing my screen and pulling it up. So hopefully you have it handy. If not, if you could get it handy, that would be helpful. I did that because I think it'll be easier for us to be a little bit interactive. Most of my presentations work better if I answer questions, if you have an opportunity to, provide your experiences with the topics as opposed to me just talking for 90 minutes straight. So that's the reason for doing that. Hopefully everybody is comfortable with that. That being said, I think there's a couple ways, well, 3 ways we can probably do this. I certainly don't have any problem if you want to just verbally interrupt me. That's perfectly fine to ask a question or bring up another point. If you wanted to raise your hand, I will look as best I can at everybody and call on whoever looks like they have something to provide or a question to ask. Or we can use the chat feature, which I think you're all familiar with and someone has already utilized to make a comment. So I'll do my best to look at that as we go. I will apologize for the visual one. It's hard to look at 13 different screens, and with Zoom, I never know really where I'm looking. So I apologize for that. I'll do my best. Is that fair for everybody? Does that make sense? Thumbs up? Cool. Got to get my screen back on my phone, sorry. Good, well, thank you for that. Again, appreciate the opportunity to talk with you here. We're going to do this in 2 parts as we've laid out. So hopefully the first part, the first 90 minutes this morning will be a little bit of overview, a little bit of context, a little bit of talking about stewardship and generosity in broad terms. And then this afternoon, hopefully we'll talk about some tactics, some ideas, some programmatic things we can do in our stewardship programs to hopefully enhance them, make them a better experience for our members. Is that fair? Great. So the first slide I have is just kind of the overview with the offering plate, and it says Culture of Generosity Part 1. And I just want to take a little bit of time to introduce exactly what that means and what we're doing. About 8 years ago, the Presbyterian Foundation took over the role of stewardship education for the denomination from our sister agency, the Mission Agency. And in doing that, we realized we needed to provide some context, some purpose, some foundation, so to speak, for this teaching and for this education. So at the time, there was this book. It's called Not Your Parents' Offering Plate, which I think we all referenced, or hopefully someone referenced when you signed up, as kind of a starting point for this. And if you haven't read it, I would encourage you to do it. The author is Cliff Christopher, who is a Methodist pastor. We don't hold that against him, but Cliff was a very successful Methodist pastor in 6 different congregations, and he kind of found himself being brought to different congregations for the sole purpose of doing capital campaigns and raising money. And he learned a lot during that process. And when he was done with his ministry, he wanted to embark that information to others and wanted to create like a consulting business. And the first thing people told him to do if you were going to be a consultant was to write a book. So he wrote this book, Not Your Parents' Offering Plate, which the foundation has kind of adopted as our starting point for looking at stewardship in the life of the church and the changing dynamics that we experience in stewardship. And one of the themes of Cliff's book is to talk about stewardship in a different way, is to talk about creating a generous disciples and using the term generosity as an overall arching theme for stewardship, giving in the church. So what we've done is we've created what we call cultures of generosity, which kind of helps you create generous disciples within your congregations, creating a culture within your congregations that it's comfortable to talk about money, that it's comfortable to raise up gifts that are given, comfortable to talk about ways that we can continue to be faithful stewards of all that God has given us. And that's kind of been the context for the foundation's stewardship education out to congregations, and our resources kind of flow off of that. So a lot of what we'll talk about this morning stems from that book, stems from the contexting, stems from around generosity as opposed to stewardship. Does that sound fair? Does everybody kind of understand that so far? So the second slide that I provided is kind of just a comical way of thinking about money in the church, and probably something that we've all experienced. And if you look at it, you know, it's someone who's being baptized and the pastor says, you know, Charles, when you go down and are baptized, everything that goes underwater then becomes, you know, God's, belongs to God's. And of course, he holds up his wallet, right? Because there is this big disconnect most of the time that people have, you know, with their finances and their faith. And when I took this job 15 years ago at the foundation, someone shared with me that if we talked about finances in our congregations as often as Christ talked about finances in the Gospels, we would probably hear 17 sermons a year on money or finances. And for the most part, that doesn't happen. Now, if you're a pastor and you do more than 17 of those a year, congratulations, that's awesome, and we should do that. If you're a pastor and you do less than that, that's kind of a challenge and a barometer to think about, how can we do that? And that's not always just, you know, asking for money. That's how do we tie finances to our discipleship? How do we tie finances, you know, to everything that we do? Because it is important. We'll talk about that a little later too, and how that fits in all that we do. But that's really the context that we start off and we use as a jumping point. And then the third slide shows 2 Corinthians 9, 6-8. And it says, but I will say this to encourage your generosity, again, focusing on that theme of generosity. The one who plants little harvests little, and the one who plants plenty harvests plenty. And that we talk about in terms of, again, you know, we need to do a lot of things on a regular basis in order to plant those seeds in people's heads that, you know, will eventually be harvest. Now, that may not be tomorrow, that may not be this year, but if we don't start talking about it, if we don't start encouraging folks to think about their finances and how they can be faithful stewards, we know that we're never going to be able to harvest or have anything to harvest. And then giving grows out of the heart. We'll talk about generosity at the center of this later on in a few slides. And then God is ready to overwhelm you with more blessings than you could ever imagine, so that you'll always be taken care of in every way, and you'll have more than enough to share. And then that kind of builds off the theme of, you know, giving begets giving. And if we give, we get more and we feel better. And there's a lot of studies out there that show that giving is more than just transactional. There are certain things that happen to donors in a positive way when they give. When we're generous, we feel better. When we help folks, we feel good. And it's a continuous cycle. And I think that's evident here in this particular scripture. Are there any questions about that? Are there any pastors that maybe have a little bit more to offer to that particular scripture passage? Okay. The next slide, I just thought it would be good to maybe do a few slides here of how the foundation fits in. I always think it's important for you all to know who's talking to you, who's providing this information, so you can make a decision on whether or not to listen or how valid that information is. So I'll go through these 3 slides, and then if you feel like you want to slide off the call and you're not on board, that's perfectly fine. Hopefully you won't do that. But I do think it's important for you to be on board with who's providing this information and where we're going. How many folks are familiar with the foundation already? I know a few of you are. Okay, so a couple of you aren't, so hopefully this may be new, but you know, our denomination is made up of several layers of judicatory systems. One is a congregation, you all. One is the Presbytery, you all, that has brought us here together. The next level is synods, and then the national church is made up of 6 agencies that do the, you know, global work and connectivity amongst congregations on a national and world level. The foundation is just one of those 6 agencies. Our OGA, which is our General Assembly, which is our governance, our mission agency, which coordinates all our mission activities, Presbyterian Disaster Assistance being one of those. That's probably very big in people's minds right now, as Laura and I think Polo come through the Gulf Coast there. We also have a publishing company. We also have an investment and loan program. We also have a pension, which the pastors and myself really appreciate because that provides our healthcare and our retirement accounts. And then the foundation, which I represent, which has been created 200 and some years ago to be the fiduciary of permanent endowment funds and financial support for congregations for long-term financial health. And the next slide says, you know, the foundation and what our goal is. Our goal is really to be a vital part of the Presbyterian Church USA that cultivates, attracts, and manages financial resources of individuals and institutions to serve Christ's mission. And what that means is you are Christ's mission. You are the ones doing the work on the ground in your communities across the globe. And the foundation is here to help you do that. We are what would be called a pass-through organization. We are a fiduciary. We hold monies on your behalf that benefit you, that were even given by you or by donors that wanted to support your activities. And we help through education, through activities, promote that, attract new gifts, cultivate those, and then of course as fiduciary, hold those and manage those in perpetuity, hopefully, or in the short term to benefit you. I like to say that, you know, your mission is our mission. We're Presbyterians helping Presbyterians, and, you know, we have the resources to do all of those things. So that's kind of how the foundation is established. Does anybody have any questions about that or any thoughts about the foundation or any experiences with the foundation at their own congregation? Okay. Great. The next slide we can probably skip over. You see me, so you don't need to see my picture again, but I did provide that so you would have my contact information. My title is Vice President for Ministry Relations, so I have the fortunate opportunity to oversee my colleagues across the country who work closely with congregations to do this work. And then I also serve as a ministry relations officer and cover Michigan and Ohio. I live in Kalamazoo, Michigan, Southwest Lower Michigan, have been serving the 11 presbyteries of the Synod of the Covenant for 15 years at the foundation, and enjoy doing this kind of work for them. So I am kind of dual role and get to take my experiences across the country and share it locally with those folks. I am a PK. Does everybody know what a PK is? Are there any fellow PKs on the call? Nobody else is a PK. I'm a PK. That's probably all I need to tell you because you've already probably made up your mind about me, because PKs are either thought of very highly or we're the you know, the trouble-causing kids running around the church that we think we own the place. I was probably more of the latter than the former. Did not get the call as my dad and my grandfather did to be a pastor, but have enjoyed bringing my education in fundraising through Western Michigan University, which is my alma mater, which is where I worked for 16 years before coming to the foundation in different capacities of traditional higher ed fundraising, and have been using those skills as service to the church for the last 15 years. So hopefully that will be of value as we talk about some of these things. So again, like I said, this is the point where you can jump out and go, no, I don't think I'm going to listen to this person or the foundation, or you get to hang on for the next hour and 15 minutes to listen to the rest of this. So we will jump into it. The next slide talks about what is stewardship. Again, we've talked a little bit about, stewardship versus generosity, and some of the things that Cliff in his book has got us to think about as we talk about Christian stewardship in the future. But this just highlights a few things that we believe stewardship is through the foundation. And I think the text from Matthew 6:21 is really appropriate in this. And it says, where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. I think most of us would agree that, we tend to spend our money on the things that are closest to our heart. I was once told too that if you wanted to know what people cared about, you could just go through their checking account and see what they're spending their money on, and that would tell you what they're passionate about. Today, that would probably be like a Venmo account or a credit card account or some other account, because we don't use checking accounts, but I think it's still factual. I still think it's accurate that our money is tied to our hearts. And I think we use our money to express what we are compassionate about, what we care about, and what we hope can make a difference in the world. And hopefully that is a Christian statement of faith, as well as how we lead our life. And we will talk about that three-legged stool of time, talent, and treasure later. But this is really at the crux and really shows that scripturally our money is tied, to our discipleship, to our faith, and that we need to continue to remember that. And as we as leaders encourage folks to go down their spiritual journey, we have to understand that those are tied, and we have to be good at, providing examples and opportunities and ways that people can continue to be faithful disciples of their and stewards of all that God has given to them. And then secondly, stewardship is the church's theological antidote to the chief idols of our age, consumerism, materialism, and acquisition. I think we all can find experiences in our life where sometimes those secular things, and I'll call them secular things for lack of a better term, tend to take over from our spiritual activities. I have 3 sons who were very fortunate to have been gifted athletic ability, and they were able to experience their athletic gifts at very high levels. And I will admit that there were times when they were younger that we made decisions that I probably would have done differently looking back, where we chose athletics activities over some of our church things. Maybe instead of, having my sons attend youth group on a Wednesday night, they were probably at a Little League or at a field, or doing football activities and those kinds of things. And I think it's something that we really do have to battle in this world. What's that balance? What's that priority? How are we going to do that? And can we lead our faithfulness in those activities as well? Is there an opportunity to do those activities in a faithful way that shows our gratitude back to God? My sons were certainly given by God that ability in order to do that. But how do we say thank you? How do we lead our lives as examples for others, even in the midst of all of those challenges, all of those things that come up, all of those other outside sources that can take our money, our time, and our talent? And how do we use all of that? And know that we're going to spend quite a bit of time this morning talking about the competition that's out there for our dollars, and the reality that exists as a congregation to know that, we're asking folks to support our activities, but there are other good organizations also out there asking them to support their activities. And how do we do that? How do we balance that? How do we guide them through that? How do we, lead by example? And how do we do that? Does that resonate with anybody? Does that make sense? Has anybody else experienced that kind of secular spiritual conflict that I just poorly outlaid there? I see a few heads shaking. Great. Matt, did you have something you wanted to say there, or just agreeing?
I don't know if you would speak about it later on, and if you will, that's great. But I just really appreciated the phrase joyous discipline,
Okay.
as opposed to just discipline or spiritual discipline. That seems like it would be a very important piece of, as pastors, of helping people connect to the joy of what their time, talent, and treasure can do on behalf of the Lord, or behalf of a congregation, or behalf of a community, and get beyond just, beyond just that it's a spiritual discipline, but that it can be a joyous spirit, that it can enrich their lives even as they're spending their lives. I don't, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, it does, and I'm glad you bring that up, and I think we will in a few other slides get to talk about this. But a lot of our education has been trying to get congregations and leadership to understand that if we're truly going to be effective leaders in regards of Christian stewardship, we do, as Matt says, have to focus on the donor and be donor-centered and how it impacts them, as opposed to being church-centered and how it impacts the church's financial budget. And I don't mean to imply that it's really one or the other, because there is both aspects of it. We all realize the reality is the church needs to receive money in order to be able to do their work. But we also need to realize that the process needs to be about the donor and that joy that can come from giving. There are plenty of studies out there that show that positive things happen physiologically in the body when someone gives, whether it's of time, talent, or treasure. And we have to understand that, and we have to focus on that and make it more about the donor than the church. At least lead with that, right? At least when we're talking about the stewardship program and stuff, understand how does it impact the donor? What are they experiencing? What do they feel? How can we make that joyous? And a lot of that starts with gratitude and thanking them and coming from a place of gratitude, which we'll talk about. But Matt, I think you're exactly right. I think that word joy is extremely important in that process. And I think that's the third thing on this slide that says stewardship is about the joyous discipline of thanking God with the way we live our lives and spend and share our money from that. The next slide talks about what is stewardship. Again, it's gratitude, it's spiritual growth, it's about making choices, it's caring for all that God has given us, it's time, talent, and treasure, and it's disciple making. And I think the challenge as stewardship chairs, as stewardship committees, as pastors, as elders, as leaders of our churches, how do we understand all of that? How do we weave all of those very important and actually very complex ideas into our stewardship program? How many of us are stewardship chairs or have served on a stewardship committee in their church? Great. So you probably understand those challenges and understand what that is, and maybe have experienced some of these through your time or incorporated some of those in your stewardship campaigns from there. Let's talk a little bit about some of these one-on-one, and the first one is gratitude. And I think I've said this a few times already, but I really want to kind of unpack this a little bit and talk about gratitude, and that stewardship starts with gratitude. If you read Cliff's books, I'm going to give away one of the things at the end. Cliff really talks about putting these things into action and how do we do that. And one of the things he challenges folks from that book to do is to write thank you notes. Something simple, something easy you can do. He says you can write 10 thank you notes a week as a pastor, as elders, as a stewardship committee and chairs, and write thank yous that don't necessarily revolve around money either. I mean, most of us have wonderful members who are contributing to the church in many ways, whether it's singing a solo or whether it's, clearing the sidewalk on a blustery, winter day, which we all experience in the Midwest and in those winter months. Whether it's fixing something, whether it's, bringing food to, an elderly person in a shut-in, there are lots of things that we can say thank you to people. And he encourages us to do that just as a discipline, incorporating that into our normal day-to-day activity. We have a big activity called Stewardship Kaleidoscope that happens, well, now in the fall. It used to happen in March. Unfortunately, this year, because of the pandemic, they're going to do a few things virtually and we can't gather together. But I had a pastor one time who went to Stewardship Kaleidoscope, sat in on one of these workshops, heard them talk about thank you notes, and she said, I can't do a whole lot because of all the other things that I've got going on in a small church, but I certainly can write thank you notes. And she shared with me after she started doing that she saw an increase of 20% in their stewardship giving. And she can't, directly link that increase, from the thank you notes and saying, thank you more. But she firmly believes that, there is a relationship, whether it's a direct or whether it's ancillary. There was just a shift she saw in the way people thought about stewardship, the way they thought about money and how they felt, again, getting back to Matt's concept, how they felt about it when people actually appreciated what they did. How many of us send receipts for gifts that are given to the church, right? I would hope all of us send a receipt. How many of us send a thank you? How many of us send that together? A few of you. I would encourage you to think about maybe separating that and keeping the receipt and the thank you separate. So the thank you message doesn't get lost in the receipts. The receipts are important for folks to do that transactional thing and to get their taxes and whatever they need to on that regard. But the thank you is really far more than that, right? It's really showing them how important, their time or their talent or their treasure is to the church. And keeping that separate, I think, is something that can highlight that and emphasize that and make sure that the message doesn't get lost in there, okay? And again, it's all about the joyous discipline of giving. I think we need to make sure that we're doing that. I want to make sure that we understand, as Matt said, that this is a joyous discipline. This is something that needs to be incorporated in what we're doing. How many of us have ever sat through a new member class at church? Show of hands, okay. Yeah, most of us have, right? That's a common ritual. In those membership classes, how many of them actually talked about, giving or the process or what happens with giving in the church and what the expectations are? Okay, not as a couple, that's good, not as many hands. I sometimes think that that's a missed opportunity for us. I think that sometimes we think that might scare folks away, and it might. But if it's truly a part of the culture of the church, it seems to make sense that if you're inviting someone into that culture, that needs to be something that's addressed. It doesn't need to be, necessarily overt. It doesn't need to be, a solicitation time or an ask. But it does, I think, help new members to kind of feel more comfortable and understand the process, whether we, still pass the plate, whether we're collecting gifts online, the different things that we have opportunities for them to support. I think it's important for them to understand that, so when they come and they experience those things, they know what it is and they're not, left wondering or trying to figure it out on their own, and that they know that, this is important, and it is part of being a member, and it is a discipline that we have. And I think if done properly, it can be a really good way to set expectations. It can be a really good way for people to feel comfortable. I know there's a lot of emphasis in my congregation to be opening and welcome and friendly, and it's something that I know a lot of congregations try to do. And when I look at their faith statement, or I look at their mission statement, that's part of it. We want to be welcoming and open and friendly. And sometimes I think our processes and our worship styles and what we think is pretty understandable by a lot of our members can be a little daunting to guests and members, and I think new members. And I think the more we keep people informed, let them know what the process are, the more we can make them comfortable, I think we can reduce some of that anxiety, and I think we can include giving in that process and the way we do that. The last thing talks about abundancy versus scarcity. This is an extremely important point of Cliff's and in all his books that he's written. I think too many times in the past, we've seen success from a lot of members who responded to a call to action or a need out of scarcity. I think a lot of times we think that, if something comes up during the year, maybe a crisis, maybe, the roof starts leaking and we need to raise $80,000 for the roof, or, something happens and we need, some money, that we can talk about, giving at that time, or that if we're going to be short in the budget, we can just go back and say, hey, look, we're going to be short. Can people please give more? And people will respond. And I think we've had those golden angel donors who have come in and provided those resources. And I think we've relied on that. And I think that's a missed opportunity to talk about, all the good things that are going on. I know we'll talk about donor impact and donor motivation in a little while, but people want to make a difference in their giving. People don't like to give, for the most part, to things that aren't successful, to things that are bleak, that they think aren't working, that aren't successful. And that scarcity model doesn't work as well as I think we've seen it in the past. And I think we need to understand the motivation of donors and how we can do that a little better, and talk about the abundance that God has given us, the blessings that he's received, that we've received from him, even when it sometimes feels like maybe that's not the case, or that things are dire or desperate or need. And we need to continue to remember that, and we need to continue to do that. It's not to say we're supposed to hide from that, or we're supposed to not be transparent in what's going on. But I think the challenge is to, how do we spin that in a great way? How do we talk about, the abundance and the blessings first, and then the need and the situation later, and making sure that people understand that even when times seem bleak, we are blessed. We are blessed as God's children. We are blessed as a denomination. We are blessed in lots of ways, even though we are given challenges along the way as well. And to do that, how many of us in our congregations message that way? How many of us look at things and talk about, all of the abundance and the blessings and the good things that can be done in our churches, as opposed to talking about, wow, we're short this month, we need more, we're short this year, we need to increase, those kinds of things. Has anybody got any good ways that they're doing that, or stories about that?
Yeah, one thing that we did with our church is we actually dug up the old history books and read the history of the church. And it was, I think, pretty life-giving, because kind of taking on the identity of, we were a mission plant out here in the middle of nowhere. I think that really gave people some hope and connected, and they could see that, we're not just resting on our laurels, but we're part of this continuation that God has. Our church was actually built before the town was. So talking about, most people are planted, but God kind of threw soil around us. So just things like that.
Right. That's wonderful. Yeah, I think that's important. Logan, I have a church here in Tecumseh, Michigan, that did kind of a centennial campaign and focused on the life of the community and the church and its role. And they actually did the same thing. And then they actually took it one step further, and on the hallways, they put the timeline of the church and the significant community activities right on the wall, right? And made this timeline. So when people come in, they see that and the connectivity with the community. It was really impactful, and it helped them, like you said, stay grounded to what their original purpose and mission was from that. Thank you for sharing that. That's cool. I'm glad to hear others have done that. Jane?
Sorry, I think one thing that we have really seen how generous our congregation has been is now during the pandemic. Every week, the barrel in the outer lobby is overflowing with the pantry, our little food pantry we have. And we also are doing food bags for an elementary school close to our church. And we went from 20 bags to 25 bags to 30 now this year. And every week they're just overflowing, and people dropping things off, and school supplies for some of the needy schools, and extra people calling everybody to check up on them or to send cards. So I think during the pandemic, it's not only people needed to have things to do, but they know that what they're doing is being noticed by others.
Wonderful. Yeah, that kind of slides us right into the next slide about recognition and saying thank you too. Wonderful segue, and thank you for sharing that. That's good to hear and see the connection that you have with the community and the folks. I think that's important, and people need to know, again, like I said earlier, that what they're doing is appreciated, and what they're doing makes a difference. And the more you can connect, with those activities and the purposes of the church and the congregation, are extremely important. And, recognition and saying thank you is a part of that. We already talked about doing thank you notes. There are other things that can be done, annual celebrations, annual thank you celebrations, not just after the stewardship campaign when we say, yay, we reached our goal, or thank you for everybody for participating. But just thank yous throughout, the year. We have a wonderful process in our worship style as Presbyterians called Minute for Missions. Those are wonderful opportunities to show the connectivity between the congregation and the members, to the community and the activities and stuff. I have a church it's not my church because I don't cover Portland, but I was traveling with my colleague out in Portland and Westminster. In Portland has done a wonderful job because and maybe you all don't experience this, but I've talked to several pastors and stewardship leaders who struggle with this, is that we know that our Presbyterian members are very generous and give a lot. And the average Presbyterian gives to 7 different things, the church being one of those. But we're going to talk a little bit about this on another slide. There are a lot of other great activities that people can give to, and we know that Presbyterians give to 7 different things. Westminster and Portland for many years was struggling with, trying to, compete with those dollars and get those members to give to the church instead of those other activities and all this stuff. And they finally realized that it was going to be kind of a losing battle, so to speak. So the pastor out there, he and his wife said, well, why don't we look at this differently? Why don't we start, collecting data on all of the things that our members are supporting, not just the church, and let's start raising that up and praising that and saying thank you for the difference that our members are making in our church, but in these other organizations. So they not only started counting their stewardship dollars, but they started counting their other activities, those 7 other organizations, and they started counting, volunteer hours, and they started counting, things that other people were doing outside of money. And then they packaged this all together and raised up all the good works that that their members were doing, all the other dollars that were being put into the community activities, as well as the money that was coming into the church. And it just raised the level of consciousness of what we're doing as a faith community above and beyond just our walls. And they started seeing an increase in not only their giving to the church, but the giving to these other activities. And other people said, wow, this is what we're doing. I want to get on board. I want to give more. And it just, again, that place of abundance instead of scarcity. And it started raising the level of everything. And instead of fighting it, they got on board with it. And it made a huge difference to them. And they're doing. It takes work, don't get me wrong, to do that and to collect that data. But I think Greg, the pastor, thought that the time and the energy to do that was valuable and showed a good picture of what it does. There are a lot of times where we work with congregations that are struggling to survive. There's probably none of those in Missouri River Valley Presbytery. But there are some. Okay, I got a few smiles out of that, so that's good. All right. That is a common thing. And it's okay, as long as we understand it and we can help, and how do we transition from that ministry to something else. But a lot of times we talk to churches that are thinking about it, and the discernment process in that is to really think about, okay, what would the community look like if the church ceased to exist? And having those conversations and looking can be a really good starting point to understand, to Logan's point, what is our call here? What were we called to do? What were we created to do? How were we, impacting the community, and what can we get? And getting back to that, that outward look of the impact we're making, instead of that internal look of how do I keep the lights on? How do I keep the building, going? How do I pay, staff and all that stuff? Again, we still have to do all that stuff, but if we focus on that external, that mission-driven activity, it tends to be more positive, more well-received, and more joyful and meaningful to the members who were asking to participate and contribute in that. The next slide talks about the time, talent, and the treasure, and I think that's extremely important. How many of us in our stewardship campaigns keep track of any volunteer hours that people put in, or how much time they serve on committees, or work they do inside the church besides just, making a pledge or giving to mission activities? Does anybody do that? If you don't, again, like Westminster in Portland, I would encourage you to think about that. Too many times I think we've assumed that it's time, talent, or treasure. And I think if you look at this slide, we want to make sure that we understand it's time, talent, and treasure. It's a three-legged stool for a purpose. And if you cut one of those legs off, what's going to happen? That stool's going to fall over, right? And it doesn't become a very good foundation to sit on. And I think we need to remember that it is time, talent, and treasure. And I think we need to figure out how we can incorporate, the time and the talent into our processes instead of just the treasure as well. So I encourage you to think about that. I encourage you to figure out ways to count that. I've worked with a lot of churches and asked them if they even know how many people have been in their building on a weekly basis. Do you all track that at all? That's a good number to have. We're going to talk about narrative budgets this afternoon, but understanding how many people are coming to the church, how many people come to your activities, how many people do you run into when you go somewhere else and participate or volunteer. Tracking those numbers can give you this good sense of connection and how many people you're truly impacting through your ministries. And the building is a ministry, right? The building and being there and having people come and, have meetings or, participate in activities, Vacation Bible School and Alcoholics Anonymous and choir and youth group and all those things. Those are all mission activities. Those are all connections out to the community and to people. And painting that picture for people and letting them know how many people are impacted by those activities can be an extremely important part of this creating a culture of generosity. It all starts creating that picture and showing that. The next slide just kind of highlights what stewardship is not, because I think sometimes we tend to fall into that category of, this is what we've done in the past, this is what it is. And we encourage you to not think about it as a once a year event. We talk a lot in our educational opportunities about year-round stewardship. I told you that, if we talked about finances as often as Christ talked about it in the scriptures, we'd have 17 sermons on money. You can't do that all in a 3-month period of time, October, November, December, right? That's got to be year-round. We also want to do that with our stories and with other things we do. How many of us do a newsletter? Do we all do a newsletter? So go out like once a month? That's a great opportunity to tell stories, right? That's a great opportunity, 12 times a year to talk about the impact and the things that are going on. And I encourage you to use vehicles like that to tell those stories, to include that more often than not. Again, we talked about Minute for Mission, which is, 52 opportunities a year where we can talk about our mission and the impact we're having. Stewardship is not all about money. We've talked about that. Stewardship's not fundraising. How many of us sometimes think that stewardship is fundraising? I mean, the goal is to raise funds. I understand that. But stewardship really isn't. Stewardship is really, again, some of the things we've talked about. It's a discipline. It's a spiritual activity. It's a joyous occasion. It's about other things than just money. Sometimes in fundraising vernacular, we talk about friend raising over fundraising. Has anybody ever heard that? Friend raising. Stewardship really is. It's fundraising, right? It's getting people bought in back to that, scripture of where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. It's getting people bought into what's going on. I think that scripture passage can go the other way too. I think where people's heart are, there their treasure will be also. And I think if you can get people bought into the activities, if you can get them connected, Jane's example of, having people in with the backpacks and the food and connecting to people, if you get people physically engaged in your mission activities and feel moved, that's when they're going to feel compelled to make a gift, to support it financially, because they feel that heartstring, they feel that joy that Matt mentioned that comes with giving, and that's a perfect opportunity to combine time, talent, and treasure all together. So it's fundraising, not necessarily fundraising. It's definitely not meeting a budget. We're going to talk about that with narrative budgets a little later. And then it's not about us. Again, I think I've said that. We strongly recommend us turning that lens around and looking at the donor and being donor-centered, looking at the community and being mission-driven. It's not about the church. Again, the church needs the money. We understand that. Budgets are important. We have to be fiscally responsible, but the messaging needs to be different. The messaging isn't, we need $100,000 of expenditures, which means we need $100,000 of gifts. We only have 80,000. Everybody give a little more and we'll get there. No. It's about the impact we're making with individuals' lives. It's about the missions that we're doing, and then matching that with the gifts and the opportunities to support that. And then that will support, the budget. We're going to talk about some of those specifics later this afternoon, but that's the foundation of it. A theology of stewardship. We talk a little bit about our first memories of stewardship. Does anybody have a first memory of stewardship, or something that in their past they learned how to be good stewards or to give, whether it's financially or whether it's, we talk globally, right? We talk about global warming and being good, stewards of the earth and all that stuff. Anybody have a good story?
I'll start my first memory of stewardship, and it was sitting in the pew of the church in Hereford, Texas. We're about halfway to the front, halfway to the back, and the ushers start walking down the aisle, and I think this happened every week. My mom would go, "Oh," and she'd grab her purse and grab the checkbook and write out the check real quick, trying to make sure it was done before the plate went by her.
Right.
And so, but I've learned, and I've heard other adults talk about that over the years, especially now I've served in a lot of rural communities, and in a lot of rural communities, you'll have people who kind of give an annual pledge, and so they give in December when the harvest is complete or whatever. And I remember hearing a guy one time who did that. He would give an annual pledge, but he always made sure they had a couple of dollars in his pocket because he had 3 granddaughters that sat in a pew with him every week. And he wanted those 3 granddaughters to see him put something in the offering plate when it went by on a weekly basis. And and so I just think that's kind of my, from my mom, but then other people, those are those first memories of stewardship, or maybe what our parents, grandparents, people around us are doing.
Beautiful. Yeah, thank you for sharing. I like that too. It is important, right? The people in our lives who show us how to do that, and we have to remember too that that's our call for the next generation too, right? Is to step up and then be that role model that your grandpa was in that, or your mom was in those stories. Jane, you were going to say something?
Yeah, I can't get it on. So really unmuted. There.
Oh, there you go. You're back on mute though. Jane, you're back on mute. There you go.
Okay. It's probably when I was 3 years old. And that was back when Dad, you physically would go to the bank with a paycheck instead of direct deposit.
Right.
My sister and I would be allowed to take turns, and we get to put the offering in the old time envelopes yet. And that's what my parents did first, was to pay the church, give their tithes to the church every year. And every year they would do above and beyond. So every December they would write an extra check above and beyond to give back to the church. I started doing my first pledge card when I was in Sunday school, and we had Sunday school pledges. And then when I was confirmed, I started filling out a pledge card. And I even did that in college. So I guess my recollection of stewardship was back at a young age. And I guess that's where, stewardship is a big thing to me. Even to go back to stewardship, the last year my mother was alive, she had dementia. And before she passed away, she said, "Did you write out the above and beyond check to the church?"
Oh my God.
I had a good year, so I did that. And so I've always learned that stewardship was important to a church, not only to give back to God, but it makes you feel good too.
Wow, what a great story. Thank you for sharing that. It does make you feel good. Does anybody else have any thoughts they want to share that? Linda, go ahead.
Well, I just wanted to say, the first time I went on session, I said I would be anything except stewardship chair, stewardship or finance. I would do anything else. But my last time of being elder, I was stewardship chair, because you mature in it. But now as children's director for a church, I'm trying to teach the kids start really young, and they're great about giving to mission causes and that. But the books that I have are all old on children and stewardship. Do you know of any more current resources?
Yeah, I wish I did. That's something we've been struggling with and we're trying to figure out. I think the one that most people refer to these days is through the Ecumenical Stewardship Center. I don't know if you've all heard of that.
Oh, okay.
The Ecumenical Stewardship Center has a lot of resources. They do the Giving magazine. They have some, campaign resources and stuff. The one that they've been promoting, Linda, is called Stubear, Stubear.
Okay.
Stubear. It's really good, and I think people like it. It tends to be more towards the younger side, right? For younger kids, there's really nothing good for that. Middle school, high school, and we understand that's a void. We're working on it. We're trying to figure out something, but right now, I would go to the Ecumenical Stewardship Center and look, and then see Stubear. You may be able to take Stubear and adapt it for the older kids as well. But some of the best things that I've ever seen are some creative pastors who have done some things on their own. I have a pastor in Minneapolis. He's retired now, Bill Chadwick. He was a puppeteer, and he would bring out his hand puppets and use them to teach stewardship and those kinds of things with the kids, which was clever. But I yet to have a really good children's age curriculum, Linda. Steve
Okay,
Ayers about
well,
the best. So
thank you. Thanks.
yeah, and I think on my resource slide, I think the Ecumenical Stewardship website is on there, so you can look at that and go to their resources. Tom, were you gonna share something before Linda jumped in?
Yeah, I remember how we promoted 1 great hour of sharing in my church. And it was in Sunday school, and everyone took their box home. And it was a big deal. We always had our boxes on the table during Lent. And often my birthday was during Lent. And everybody who came to the birthday party, the box got passed around.
Oh, wow.
And it was really nice to see. I have an older brother, and we didn't compete, but we both got to participate, and that felt really good. And I still have really, really warm memories about those boxes, even though they've gotten really, really hard to assemble and put together, and I mangle them now. When they were, when I was a kid, they were nice, almost nice box things that were box shaped, and yeah. So I always have. When we do children's church, I always have the kids put a box together for me because I can never figure it out.
Yeah, I remember those. I always thought mine were in the shape of a church, weren't they? They had a little steeple on them and stuff. But yeah, thank you. Anybody else? So I think that's a good activity too for folks. Whether it's in adult Sunday school or what other format, asking folks to think about that and remember, their, indoctrination into stewardship or their memories. All three of these were powerful to me, and thank you for sharing those. But it can be a very good activity to kind of kick off any type of stewardship campaign, to get people to think about it and to remember. And Matt, as you shared, and Jane, it just reminds me of people, right? Whether it's your mom or your grandpa or somebody, it reminds you of people. And I think that strong people relation, connection is extremely important in the giving process. We'll talk about that in donor motivation in a little bit, but people give to people, right? And people learn from people, and it's a relational thing. And if you can, bring up those positive relational connectivities with stewardship in people's past, that can be a good groundwork for them thinking about it as they move forward and what their commitment's going to be and those kinds of things. So I encourage that. The next slide is talking about diagnostic questions. I threw those in there, not necessarily to talk about today, but to give you some ideas of things you should be, asking yourselves. And perhaps you've already asked yourself some of these questions, and that's why you decided to spend some time with me today, was to get some answers to these. But, these are good questions to ask in your committees, talk to your elders about, just to kind of evaluate where you are and make decisions on where you want to be in the future. The next few slides talk about the changing landscape. We are blessed in church life that religion still is the largest receiver, the largest portion of receiving gifts, the philanthropic pie. We still receive the largest portion of philanthropic gifts in the country. The bad news is that's shrinking. If you look at the third slide in on changing trends, go from landscape, then the picture with the lion and the pie graph, down to the giving trends where it shows about giving to religion. You'll see in the early 90s, we were 51% of the charitable gifts coming in were going to religion. And in 2010 to 2014, that's down to 33%. That's even lower. I actually think it's dipped below 30% for the first time last year, or not this year, last year would be the statistics. That's a big decline. That's something we really need to understand, not necessarily from the scarcity, woe is us, but from the understanding that we're being asked to do more with less, that there is competition for our dollars, as we mentioned earlier, and that there are things that we need to understand that aren't necessarily being done through the church anymore. So back in the 90s, and if you take this even back further to the 50s and 60s, everything was done through the church, right? all the philanthropic activities were done through the church. People gave to the church and trusted the church then would provide all those things. If you go to the next slide after giving to religion, you'll see that there are about 1.5 million charitable organizations in the US currently, and only about a third or a fifth of those are congregations. Good work is being done outside the church, and that's okay. We just need to know that. And again, like Westminster and Portland, they chose to go ahead and engage in that, accept that, and start counting that. I've got a church here in Marshall, Michigan, that was going through some, deficit issues and all of that, and wondering why they weren't, getting folks to show up for their Wednesday evening meals, and it was quite a big expense to put that on and all of that. And what they realized is people weren't coming is because there were other activities out in the community at that same time. Other organizations were doing, Wednesday meals and get-togethers, and it was taken away from them. So instead of fighting that and trying to be better at it and keep throwing money at it to try to make it bigger, stronger, and money they didn't have, they said, well, what if we didn't do a Wednesday dinner, but instead we went out and started sharing in those Wednesday dinners that other people are doing? They're incurring the expense. We're just going. If there's a $10 charge to, pay the $10, whatever, that's still cheaper than us doing it. And they started doing that. And then they started finding that people would ask them, well, why are you here? And they got an opportunity to do that 4-letter word in our church called evangelism in different settings. They got to talk to people out in the community about First Presbyterian Church in Marshall. They didn't start doing that. They didn't just show up the first night and start saying, hey, I'm from First Pres, and this is, they waited. They gave it time, and as people asked them, they started to talk, and they started to share about things that were going on at First Pres. They participated in the life of these other organizations, and at the same time got to tell their story. And again, I'm not here to say this is a direct correlation, but after a few months of doing this, the pastor, who's a good friend of mine, received a check in the mail for $100,000 from a non-member. And she called me and goes, Steve, what am I going to do with this? I said, well, you better call that person and thank them, right? Thank them for that gift. Tell them the importance that that money is going to have. And then also take the opportunity to find out why they gave you that money. We want to know that, right? We want to know the motivation. So she did that. She's really good. And she went and she talked to the person. And she found out that, the gentleman didn't have any ties to the Presbyterian Church, but was a long-time resident of Marshall, and was just excited that the church took the opportunity to come and participate in these community activities. And when he started hearing about the other activities that the church was doing, he realized that if the church wasn't there, that there'd be a void and these things wouldn't occur. So he said, I need to support this church so the community and the church can have this symbiotic relationship and we continue to grow as a community together. And I'm not coming to church, but I want to give you $100,000 for your activities. What a wonderful thing. I mean, what a statement of the difference that going out and participating can have instead of expecting everybody to come to the church, right? A lot of times we get in that mentality of, build it and they will come. We have this church, have these activities, people will just come. Well, no, we have to meet them at their place. We have to go out and talk, and we have to do that. Now, I'm not a theologian, and the others of you on the call probably could make this connection better. But if I'm not mistaken, that's what Jesus did, right? Jesus didn't always wait for people to come to him. He went and met them and talked to them and, did that and had dinner with tax collectors and got shunned for it, right? And turned them around. But I think that's an important part and a good example. And again, I'm not here to say, that's going to happen to you. I hope it will, but it can happen and it does happen. And we have to understand, how we can make an impact in people's lives that we may never know. But we've got to go do it, and we've got to go out and be a part and meet people there. Does that make sense? Did that story really go off the track, sir? I apologize if I didn't share that very well, but I think it's a really good example of how we can look at things different, how we can say, we don't always have to be the one holding the dinner. You know, we don't have to put that manpower in. We can go spend our energy doing other things about that. Did I ruffle any feathers by the word evangelism or calling it a 4-letter word or not? Does anybody have any thoughts on that? I know that's a trigger point in some conversations that I have. Sometimes people just gloss over it, but did that bother anybody, or did I ruffle any feathers, or are you all pretty good with that and think that as well? Any thoughts on that? Does anybody use evangelism maybe in a different way or in a traditional way too in their church? Do you all do something that you would consider to be evangelism, or where you get to go out and tell your story?
No, we built it, so they're supposed to come to us.
Yeah, that's still in that mentality. Okay, all right. Well, then maybe this challenges you a little bit to think differently about that. And I'm not saying build it and they won't come isn't right. I think there's a lot of churches that do wonderful activities and people come and do that. But I think there's some opportunities to look at these a little different. Does anybody want to go through these slides? I put these slides of giving trends in there, not really to harp on it, but to give you a picture. I really like the 449.64 billion that comes from, you know, the IUPUI School of Philanthropy. I don't know if anybody's ever heard of Bill Enright, but Bill Enright years ago with Lilly Dollars created a School of Philanthropy at IUPUI in Indianapolis, and they do a wonderful job of collecting data and information so we can look and see what the, you know, philanthropic landscape is, and we use a lot of their data and have a good connection with them over the years, but that's where you can find it. I think Giving USA does that as well. There's some good data out there. But I would encourage you to look at those types of things to kind of understand what's going on, what's out there. I also think it's good to see that there are a lot of generous people. And we are fortunate that we have certain demographics in our PCUSA where we have a lot of generous people in our pews. And I think we need to understand that and realize that and take that in consideration. And how do we connect with them as givers, and how do we do that? So moving past the giving trends in USA, so that competition we talked about, the next slide talks about donor motivation. And this is something in Cliff's book that I think is extremely important. There are lots of reasons why donors give, but the 3 top reasons that donors give are on this slide. The first one is making an impact. Donors want to make an impact in people's lives. They want to know that their money is making a difference. So we need to make sure we understand that. And if we're going to do like Matt said and make this a joyous discipline, we need to understand that, and we need to make sure that the connections are made between the monies we received and the impact that they're having. So collecting that data, understanding, you know, how many people are in our building, how many people received a backpack, Jane, from our programs, how many people are receiving meals from our food banks, how many people, you know, are participating in our other activities is important to do that. The second reason they give is the financial stability. We talked about that earlier. People don't want to give to things that aren't financially sound. So we need to show that. We need to show that, you know, if we receive a gift, then we need to be responsible and good fiduciaries back to that individual and to show them and keep that communication. This is where that transparency comes in. This is where we show that, hey, look, you know, we took a $100,000 gift from this individual, and this is the difference that it made, and these are the things that we did with it. And anytime that we do something, we need to make sure that we are thanking and praising the dollars behind it that allowed us to do those activities. And whether that's in worship, whether that's in our newsletters, whether that's at, you know, any other time, if someone gave us $100,000 and we were able to do things, we need to thank them, and we need to show them, and we need to connect that money to those activities to show that we are financially sound and that we are stable and we are good fiduciaries of that dollars. The last one of the 3 is that we need to believe, or the donors need to believe in the leadership. They need to know that the leaders are capable of carrying out the mission. And that's important. And our leaders need to be strong. They need to be willing to be out in front. They need to be willing to show that, hey, we can do that. And if someone entrusts us with money, we're going to make sure that, you know, the activities get done in an effective and impactful way. And we need to be out front of that. You know, in secular fundraising at the university, we do a lot of campaigns, as you can imagine, right? We're either thinking about a campaign, in the middle of a campaign, you know, completing a campaign, or preparing for the next campaign. And part of those campaigns, the important part is that the leadership are our primary givers, right? We don't ever go into a campaign at a university or a hospital without our board of trustees, without our leadership making those initial gifts. They are bought in, right? People want to see that. Donors want to know that their leaderships are bought in, they're committed, and they have a stake in that. Too many times a donor will say, well, why would I give if the leadership doesn't give, right? It makes sense. So we need to do that. We need to motivate our leaders. We need to be bought in as leaders and show that and convince donors that we are the, you know, the leaders that can get this done and build that belief. There are 6 specific characteristics about giving based on, you know, philanthropic giving trends, but the top 2 are that, you know, we're donor driven and we're relationship focused. And I think we've talked about that and how we do that and making sure that our processes are doing that. We talked about choice abundancy. There are literally millions of choices out there. We talked about, you know, and we'll talk about this afternoon, but, you know, gifts coming from a variety of sources. And then we want to talk about, you know, mission transparency and how we do that as well as being extremely important in that process. Does anybody want to share their thoughts about what donor driven is? What does that mean to you when you hear the term donor driven? What does that mean? Anybody willing to step on a limb and say what donor driven means to them?
I think for
Michael?
me, in my church, we've discovered over the years that just because our mission committee decides that that's where we're going to focus our time and our money, it doesn't necessarily mean the congregation agrees. And so we've had to learn to be flexible with what we continue doing or stop doing based on what resonates with the congregation, not with a committee.
Oh, I think you're spot on. Thank you for sharing that. I think that is extremely important. That's another thing that Cliff talks about in his book and that we've experienced is, you know, the philanthropic landscape has changed over the years, obviously, that I just pointed out, but it's changed in a way that donors used to be willing to just give money to an institution and say, here, you do what you think is best. That's no longer the case. Donors want to have say, right? And we battle that a lot of time, right? Restricted dollars and having donors tie the dollars to certain things. But that's a reality. And we have to understand that reality. And I think what I heard Michael say in there is we have to listen to our donors. We have to understand what they want the money to do. And if it's different than what we want, we have to come to grips with that. We can't just go in there and say, no, you have to give to what we want to do, and that's final. No, we have to understand what they want to be a part of, again, getting back to the where your treasure, there your heart is. I mean, they're not going to be bought in and they're not going to be good, you know, joyous givers if they don't think the activities have a purpose, or it's the activities they care about, or it's things they want to see done. So we have to take that time and we have to understand that and we have to listen. How many of us have ever been in a setting where our stewardship campaign consists of one letter that goes out to everybody in our congregation? I have. I've seen that. That's probably not as effective as it used to be because of all these things that we talked about. You know, there are lots of books and lots of things out there about the different generations. Are there any genealogists in here or any people that study generations and like to talk about boomers and Gen X's and millennials and all of that?
Well, I am not a generation person, but I've been with some stewardship people who from Minneapolis, the Lutheran school up there, and they very much, you know, do some wonderful stuff with that. But I think that's a really important thing to think about. In my context, most of my givers, and I think, my mom was, that was kind of the example my mom gave was, I don't know how joyous it was just something she was supposed to do.
Right.
And she gave out of a sense of duty. And I think I'm in a context where, a majority of my folks look at church that way, that it is a duty. Showing up at church is a duty. Giving to the church is a duty. And so they don't quite understand where somebody else is coming from when it's more about, well, you haven't connected with me, so why would I connect with you?
Right.
And I think, that was, the books I read when I got into ministry about stewardship are very different than the books 15 years later coming out about stewardship. And that is, very, I think a lot of that, and I do think a lot of that is driven by the generations, Cliff's, I don't know if those were Cliff's 3 kind of reasons people give, or if those were foundations, but, the one that was missing was that sense of duty, which would have been so high 30 years ago, 20 years ago.
Yeah, and that slide that I put in here with the builders, the boomers, Gen X, millennials, and all that stuff really, really touches on that, Matt. And that's why I included it. And I don't want to spend a whole lot of time, because we could spend, another 90 minutes just talking about, the different generations and what they expect and what they experience as givers. But I did give you kind of just a breakdown of it and what they're loyal to. To your point, Matt, it's changing, that just the loyalty to the institution just isn't there with different generations. And if we're going to be donor-centered, then I think we need to understand that. And we need to be willing to look at our members in different ways and group them differently. The one thing I'll add to this is not only do we have to look at them based on generation, I think we also have to look at them based on what I would call affinity. In higher ed, we have a lot of affinity groups. People are connected to my alma mater, Western Michigan University, for lots of reasons, whether it's the art program or the music program or athletics or whatever. And we target those folks differently. We don't send, one letter to everybody. We send the art community a different letter than we send the athletic community, right? There's different motivations there. I think we have that in the church too, right? Music seems to be a very big thing in a lot of congregations. There are a lot of people that love their music program. My mom was one. She loved the choir. She, when my dad stopped worshiping or stopped preaching and they had to look for a new place to worship, that was top on my mom's list, right? I got to go to a church with a great music program. That's an opportunity to a message to the people who, have an affinity to the music program differently than people that have an affinity to, maybe the youth group or, the food pantry or whatever else we're doing. I think we need to be willing to look at that and think about, well, how can I message to them in a meaningful way to them that will encourage them to be active participants, in their time, talent, and treasure. And most people that are participating in our choirs are giving of their time, obviously their talent because they can sing, and their treasure should follow that as well. So we need to know that, and we need to understand that, maybe one letter or one, message isn't the best way to reach everybody. And maybe we need to come up with lots of different messages and be willing to send, a different message to Jane and a different message to Logan and a different message to Linda, and be okay with that and understand that. It also gets us to understand our people better, right? In order to do that, you have to know them and you have to have a relationship with them. And that's the key behind all of this, to understand people and to know them and to get to know them and to have that relationship and to collect data. How many of us use a church like accounting software data, whether it's ACS or whether it's whatever it is? Is there a component in that can let you track volunteer things and what they participate in, and maybe the fact that they came to a Wednesday night dinner or that they go to Sunday school or that they sing in the choir? I would encourage you to incorporate that in that and build a little bit of a profile of your members. And it's only for the reason of making sure you know them and have that relationship. In my world, in the secular world, we have a cycle of fundraising. And part of that cycle is cultivation and what I would call friend raising. And we do that, and we build profiles, and we understand our alumni and know what they're involved in. And it's nothing more than to make sure that we're providing them that positive experience. Nothing more frustrating than when somebody claims they know you and they send you a letter that has nothing to do with what you're interested in. That's actually kind of a turnoff. And there's no reason we can't employ those same strategies and technique in the church. And I would hope that my church knows me a lot better than my alma mater knows me, and to do that. And I would encourage you to do that. Okay. I'm going to skip through the rest of these and get through, I think it's page 29. Hopefully your numbering system is the same as mine. And it talks about what is your story, because I want to take the last few minutes here of this morning session to talk about your story. Logan talked about looking back and going through your historical story and getting back to your roots of what you were established to do. How many of us, besides Logan, who already shared, thank you, Logan, for that. How many of us know our story? How many know what our story is in our church? Okay, good. How many of us can do that in a very short, concise manner? In the business world, we spend quite a bit of time talking about our mission statements, all those things. Has anybody ever heard of a 30-second elevator speech? If you haven't, a 30-second elevator speech is really an opportunity for you in a very brief period of time. Picture being on an elevator with someone and you're going from the ground floor to the 5th floor. It takes maybe, 30 seconds. And they ask you what you do. In 30 seconds, you've got to be able to tell them what you do and who you are and be able to be meaningful. I would encourage you to think about that for your church. In my example about Marshall and those folks going out and participating in other activities and getting the opportunity to do a little bit of evangelism, and they didn't start out with a 30-minute, talk to someone. It's probably a quick, hey, why are you here? Where do you go? Oh, you go to First Pres. I don't know anything about First Pres. They get about 30 seconds and then they go on to something else. And then maybe the next time they meet, they can expand on it. But that first time is really that short, brief, 30-second elevator speech that you get to say and get to entice someone to think, wow, that's a pretty exciting place. Or wow, that's pretty cool. So I would encourage you to think about that. I would encourage you to talk about your story and create your story and what that means. The church, Logan, that I told you put their timeline on the wall of the hallways. When they did their self-study to figure out what their story was going to be, they found out that the meaning for the church to the community was their bell tower. They had a bell tower, and everybody knew what was going on based on that bell tower. And the community resonated with First Presbyterian Church at Tecumseh's bell tower. So they started using that in their story because that's what resonated with people. Everything they did, everything they told, somehow they weaved the bell tower in there, whether it was through a picture, whether it was through the word bell tower, whatever had bell tower in it, because that's what people knew. And as soon as they used that, people lightened up, right? Oh, the bell tower. And they listened and they wanted to hear more. Trying to figure that out, trying to understand what our story is going to be extremely important, because storytelling is really at the crux of this. It builds relationships, it gets people connected to what we're doing, and telling those stories is extremely important. And then the next slide says, how do we tell that story? And I think we've talked about that, Minute for Missions, preaching, newsletters, brochures, testimonials. How many of us have actually been asked to do a testimonial in our church to say why we're a member or why we give or what's important to us? If you haven't, Jane, you have? Great. If you haven't or you don't collect those, I would really encourage you to start doing that. Whether it's in writing, whether it's video, those testimonials are important. Again, in secular fundraising, the premise is that people give to people. I used to have a wonderful donor in athletic, when I did athletic fundraising, who would call me once a year, and she would make me take her out to lunch, and she would give me her check. And I asked her one time, I said, look, Linda, why are you doing this? And I said, you can just mail it in, or you can, do something different. Why are you doing it? She goes, Steve, because I want to give it to a person. I want you to tell me what's going on in athletics at least once a year. I want to hear this story, and I want to know that you know who I am, and that you'll take this check and it'll get to where it needs to go. She wanted that relationship. She needed that one-on-one. She needed that thing, and we need to build that. And stories are a way to do that. So I would encourage you to do that. The last thing for this morning that I wanted to just touch on were some keys to success. And at the top of that list is to be prayerful. Again, this is part of our spiritual journey, and most of our spiritual journey should be spent in prayer. And prayer can be a lot of different forms, whether it's thanking God for all that he's blessed us with, whether it's asking for God's guidance, whether it's asking for, some inspiration, whether it's asking for, his view on our spiritual journey and where we are. But we should be prayerful. We should be asking him. He should be at the center of this. We'd like to think we have a lot of control over whether or not someone joins our church or whether or not someone gives. But the truth is, the only way that that's going to happen is if God lights their heart to do that. Now, hopefully the things we're doing allow their heart to be open for God to touch it, but God's the only one that's going to be able to touch their heart. We need to continue to pray, ask God to guide us, ask him to direct us, ask him to open our hearts so we're doing the right things. We need to continue to be prayerful, and we need to be praying about this. How can we do this better? What should be done? Have him, move us in the right direction so we're doing those things. We need to celebrate the church. I think we talked about that. We need to be visionary, right? People want to know what's going to be the difference in 15 years, 20 years, 50 years, right? It's not good enough just to say, well, what's going to happen next Sunday? Okay. Matt, I think you're right. I think people, used to be loyal. They used to just come. It used to be just, out of discipline, we're doing this. But now people want to see what's the vision. They want to get behind this. They want to make, difference in the future, in the life of the community and in the kingdom. And I think we need to be visionary. And I think we need to think about that. And I think we need to be excited about it. And then we need to communicate it. And then we need to involve a lot of people, right? I mean, many hands makes light work. And I think we need to do that. And I think we need to take a lot of time to spend on the buy-in process. I know that's something that can be easily overlooked because of time and fatigue and, bodies, but that's an extremely important part. Getting buy-in. Michael talked about it a lot, right? Going back and listening to people, not just saying, well, this is what the session wants, so you all need to do it because of the session. No. We need to spend time getting buy-in from the people in our church, from the people in the community, from the people who come and visit when they worship with us. And then we need to challenge our congregations, okay? It's not acceptable status quo anymore. We need to challenge them. We need to keep making them think. We need to keep asking those questions on that diagnostic page. We need to keep asking different questions. We need to keep asking the question of what would this community look like if we're no longer here? What would it look like if we did something different? How can we do something different? We need to challenge folks, and we need to be willing to have those conversations. And I think if we can do that, we'll be successful. This doesn't happen overnight. It takes time, it takes commitment, but I think there are a lot of things we can do to just change this from, oh, good Lord, we have to do stewardship again. Oh, goodness gracious, we have to ask for money. Oh, goodness gracious, we need to make sure we can cover our expenses. No, let's make this a part of our church. Let's change the culture. Let's make it okay. Let's make it acceptable to talk about money and talk about the things that we can do if we have more and the things we've already done with what we've already been blessed with. It is 12:30. I know we promised this to be 90 minutes this morning, and I've done that. Before we break for an hour and come back, are there any questions or final thoughts or? Seeing none, I will offer this up too. We have 90 minutes and we're going to come back. We can start the next session just going back and touching base. So let's say you're sitting there for 90 minutes and you're eating something and you're going, wow, that really didn't resonate with me. And what Steve said really rubbed me the wrong way. We can take time to go back and talk about that. Or if you say, you know what, I've been thinking about this for an hour, and you know, that point was really good, we can spend a little time talking about that too. So if needed, we'll go back and we'll do that when we get back going on at the next 90-minute session. Linda, I'm going to turn to you since I don't know if Nicole is still listening or not. Do we just stay connected and turn our cameras off, or do we leave the meeting and come back? I'm not quite sure because I only saw one Zoom link and I'm not really familiar with that. Does anybody know how we should do that?
That's the way I set it up, but honestly, I don't know because I haven't done one of these where we leave for a while.
So let's do this. I think it's okay as long as your computer won't lose power or you're plugged in. If you just turn off your camera and make sure it's on mute, you can get up and go and do anything for an hour and we won't see you. And then just, you know, we'll reconvene at 1:30 and just turn our cameras back on and, you know, get off mute and go. Does that make sense for folks? Perfect. Tom got it. He just did it. Wonderful. I'm going to do it too. Enjoy your lunch. We'll talk to you in a little while.